Hey folks, welcome back to 5 Minutes for Healing. And on today's episode, we're going to be looking at the issue of relationships and betrayal. So when trauma is perpetrated by people in our lives, rather than accidents or forces of nature, we could use a more accurate word instead of abuse or assault. We can call it betrayal. Now, betrayal wounds can't be seen, of course, but it does suggest that the individual, the survivor's relationships with other people, and particularly intimate relationships or close family ties, are altered, or significantly altered due to the harm experienced. Now, there are many factors at play that can vary this. And you can talk about how old was the survivor when the harm was done? What was the extent of the trauma or trauma load experienced by the fellow? We talk about the relative health of his upbringing with his own family, his family of origin, assuming that the abuse did not occur within the family context. And lastly, we can look at the connection, the relationship the offender had to the survivor, either prior to the trauma, during the trauma, subsequent to the trauma. So suffice to say, issues of trust and connection can be core obstacles in the lives of many men. Now, this can show up in many ways. One term we can use is the concept of insecure attachment, that the person's primary stance in relationships, it does not involve the core elements of safety and trust because of the harm done. And so given this on a whole, we can see two patterns, two primary ways that these issues of trust show in the relationships of those adults, of those men who have experienced past abuse or assault. And in referencing this, it may be useful to remind yourself of the wobble. So one expression is what we call over-distancing. This happens when the individuals put considerable distance between themselves and their loved ones, almost to the point where they self-isolate. It shows up possibly of avoiding intimacy, being reluctant to ask for help, feeling adverse to touch, even repulsed by sex. Now, the flip side of that is a pattern of under-distancing. And when we use that term, it suggests enmeshment or a codependency, or just not knowing where one person stops and the other person begins. And this shows up in a different way. It could show up as patterns of being needy or demanding in relationships, having patterns of being over-involved or overprotective of others, having a poor sense of boundaries between self and others in those relationships, and the potential for controlling behavior and or abusive behavior. So what we're getting at in terms of kind of a sweet spot is what we call the just right stance. And we can take the learnings from Goldilocks and finding that just right distance or just right stance of healthy boundaries. And this lies within the individual himself, of how to hold himself in relationships. The just right stance, it occupies a space between being neglectful on one side in relationships and being controlling on the other side. Sometimes there's a need to honor autonomy and time for the self. And other times there's a need to honor intimacy and vulnerability with a partner, with a close friend, with loved ones. So this balance we're talking about here, this this is going to be needed to reverse these past patterns of functioning. We need to overcome these patterns and find a just right stance that matches up with the working zone that we looked at last week. So, for example, a person with healthy boundaries can say no to others. And just as comfortably, they can open themselves up in those close relationships and experience what we call emotional intimacy. So, here's a bit of an action piece for you. First of all, take inventory of yourself. Ask yourself, do you tend to over-distance or under-distance in relationships? And again, this may match up with which side of the wobble you tend to lean on. I think we looked at that in episode 7. So if you tend to over-distance in relationships, what are some steps you can take to lean into connection? You may first of all need to determine your needs and wants in that relationship. Take inventory of the supports in your life and find and take small steps in letting others in. If, on the other hand, you tend to be under-distanced, the question is, what's a step or two you can take to spend time within yourself comfortably? It might be a matter of setting those boundaries where no boundaries did exist beforehand. It may be putting energy towards oneself rather than, by default, the relationship. It may be the need to be respectful of other people's limits, just as you need to be respectful of your own. Ultimately, this sweet spot means balancing opposing energies. And if you can do that, you can facilitate your healing journey even further. It means caring for yourself and caring for others, spending time that is respectful, understanding, and genuine in your relationships. Thanks for joining us today, and we ask you to stay tuned to our next video in the series of trauma and recovery. Until we meet again, friends.